The bread is still in the oven. The air smells of salt and figs and the morning's first fires. A woman adjusts a ceramic jug on a shelf above her bed, the same shelf where it has sat for 20 years. Somewhere nearby, a dog barks twice and goes quiet. Children are already in the street. The fish market is loud. The sun is climbing a sky so blue it looks painted. Nothing feels wrong. Nothing feels different. And that is the cruelest part of what is about to happen. Because somewhere above this city, a mountain that has not moved in living memory is waking up. A mountain that thousands of people have built their entire lives beneath. Have they ever wondered what lives inside it? Have they ever asked what the silence means? 2,000 years from now, archaeologists will find that woman's jug exactly where she left it, and her body cast in ash, reaching for something just out of reach. This was Pompeii, and once it began, not one person in the city understood what was killing them. The city of Pompeii in the summer of 79 AD was not the dead place we imagine when we think of ruins. It was alive, aggressively, loudly, commercially, beautifully alive. The population stood at somewhere between 11,000 and 20,000. A density that packed streets barely 4 meters wide, with bakers, dye workers, wine merchants, priests, gladiators, slaves, senators, and children playing in the gutters. There is a common assumption that ancient Roman cities were primitive, chaotic, filthy, and while they were certainly chaotic and certainly unequal, Pompeii was in many ways a city of remarkable sophistication. It had a theater that seated 5,000. It had a gladiatorial arena. It had an extensive water distribution system fed by the Aqua Augusta aqueduct, one of the greatest feats of Roman engineering that piped clean water into public fountains, bathhouses, and the homes of the wealthy. It had bakeries that produced bread on an industrial scale, some with ovens still containing loaves when they were excavated 18 centuries later. It had fast food restaurants, thermopolia, with ceramic pots sunk into stone counters to keep soups and stews warm. It had painted electoral slogans on its walls, advertising the campaigns of candidates in the upcoming local elections. It had wine bars on almost every block. By the summer of 79 AD, Pompeii had reached the apex of its prosperity. The city sat at the center of a rich agricultural belt in Campania, one of the most fertile regions of the Roman world. The slopes of Vesuvius itself were covered in lush vineyards producing wines famous across the empire. The soil was extraordinarily productive, so productive that farmers had been working these slopes for centuries without ever asking why the earth here was quite so rich, quite so dark, quite so deep. The answer had been sitting beneath them all along, locked in volcanic deposits laid down by eruptions so ancient no human memory held them. But that summer, something in the rock below Vesuvius had begun to change. The mechanism that would unmake this city was already in motion. The first signals came weeks before the eruption. They came quietly, the way disasters often begin, with small things that are easy to ignore. The wells around Pompeii had been behaving strangely. Some had gone dry, others had turned brackish. The Sarno River, which wound through the valley below the mountain, had been running warm in places where it had no reason to be warm. Across the region, minor earth tremors had been shaking cups off shelves and cracking the plaster of freshly painted walls. None of this was interpreted as warning. The Romans had no framework for understanding what was happening underground. They knew volcanoes existed. Etna on Sicily had erupted within living memory, but Mount Vesuvius was not considered a volcano. It had never erupted in recorded Roman history. It looked like a mountain, wooded, fertile, peaceful. Spartacus had hidden his rebel army in its forested crater decades earlier and found it perfectly hospitable. What was actually happening beneath the mountain was a process of violent, irresistible physics. A magma chamber deep below Vesuvius had been filling for centuries, pressurizing, heating, loading. The earthquakes and dry wells were symptoms of magma intruding into the shallow crust, the mountain clearing its throat. On the morning of August 24th, though some scholars now argue the eruption occurred in October based on pomegranate seeds, wine harvest evidence, and the weight of clothing found on victims, the pressure finally exceeded what the rock above it could contain. The precise mechanism was a phreatomagmatic reaction. Superheated magma made contact with groundwater trapped in the rock, converting it instantly to steam, and the resulting pressure spike shattered the plug that had sealed the volcanic system for centuries. One specific, horrifying detail. Geologists estimate that in the first 4 minutes of the eruption, Vesuvius expelled more thermal energy than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Not once, but repeatedly, in rapid succession. The ash column that rose above the city reached 33 kilometers into the stratosphere. The clock had started, and it would not stop until everything beneath it was silent. The great column of ash and gas rose so high it could be seen from 120 kilometers away. Pliny the Younger, watching from the naval base at Metzicenum across the Bay of Naples, described it as resembling an enormous pine tree, a single column rising before spreading at the top like branches against the sky. In the first hours, the eruption was awe-inspiring before it was terrifying. People in Pompeii stopped in the streets and looked up. Some ran immediately, many did not. The pumice and ash began to fall, lightly at first, more heavily as the morning passed. It fell like hail, then like snow, then like something that had no name in the Roman vocabulary. In the homes closest to the Forum, roof tiles cracked under the accumulating weight. The sky turned a strange yellow-gray. The sun disappeared. The streets that had been loud with commerce an hour earlier were filling with ash to the depth of a man's ankle, then his knee. The weight of accumulating tephra, the collective term for the erupted material raining down, began to collapse roofs. People sheltering inside buildings were dying not from heat, but from falling masonry as their ceilings gave way. A family on the Via dell'Abbondanza, Pompeii's main commercial street, pressed themselves into a doorway as the pumice rose around them. They did not move far enough or fast enough. They would be found in the 20th century, exactly where they had sheltered, their bodies cast in the ash that hardened around them. The postures of people who believed the worst was already passing. They were wrong. The worst was still descending the mountain. On the slopes above the city, the eruption column periodically collapsed, a catastrophic instability in which billions of tons of gas, rock, and superheated ash dropped back toward the mountain at speeds exceeding 700 kilometers per hour. These pyroclastic surges were something no living human had ever witnessed, named, or survived. The first major surge reached Herculaneum, a smaller, wealthier town on the western flank of the mountain, before midnight. Herculaneum had been thought to be further from danger than Pompeii. The prevailing wind had been carrying ash and pumice toward Pompeii, not Herculaneum, and many of its residents had fled to the sea. They gathered on the beach beneath the boat storage arches. Hundreds of people huddled together, waiting for rescue vessels that would not come in time. The pyroclastic surge hit Herculaneum at approximately 1 a.m. The temperature inside the surge exceeded 300 degrees Celsius. Everyone on the beach died in seconds. The thermal shock was so extreme that human fat vaporized, skulls exploded, and red blood pigment has been found mineralized in the skeletal remains. Physical evidence of death so instantaneous the body had no time to react. By the time the first light of morning should have returned on August 25th, Herculaneum was buried under 20 meters of volcanic material. In Pompeii, the situation was moving toward its own catastrophe on a slightly different timeline. The pumice fall had continued through the night. The streets were impassable. The city was dark. By early morning, the accumulated weight on rooftops had collapsed the majority of the city's buildings. People who had survived the night, sheltering inside, now faced collapsed ceilings, rising ash, and the unmistakable acidic smell of volcanic gas seeping through the rubble. Then, in the early hours of the 25th, the eruption column above Vesuvius collapsed again, and this surge came toward Pompeii. It moved faster than any human could run. It was a wall of superheated gas and rock fragments traveling at the speed of a racing car along the ground. The people who had made it to the streets, who had been trying to walk through knee-deep ash toward the city gates, were overtaken in an instant. The surge that killed Pompeii did not bury it. It killed everything living and left the bodies where they fell. The ash that followed, descending like grey snow for hours afterward, buried them in place. The city went silent, not gradually, all at once. In the hours between the first ashfall and the final pyroclastic surge, something extraordinary and terrible had happened inside Pompeii. Ordinary Roman life tried to continue. That is perhaps the most haunting truth about this event, that people did not understand what they were facing. The Romans had a word for earthquake, terremotus. They had words for lightning and flood and plague. They did not have a word for this. The doctors of the city, trained in the Hippocratic tradition, capable of setting bones and treating infections and recognizing the signs of fever, had no category for what they were seeing. The ash itself was acidic. It irritated lungs and eyes and skin. People began to suffer respiratory distress, choking, their airways thickening with fine particulate matter. Ancient medicine had nothing to offer. The priests of Pompeii's many temples did what priests do in a crisis. They prayed. The Temple of Isis, one of the city's most active religious centers, had been nearly fully rebuilt just a few years before after an earlier earthquake, a reconstruction paid for by a freed slave's 6-year-old son, according to an inscription that survived the eruption intact. The priests gathered inside the temple. They took the treasury with them. They waited for divine intervention that would not come. Several were found dead inside, still clutching sacred vessels. The government of the city, the duoviri, the elected magistrates who managed Pompeii's civic life, had no emergency protocol equal to this. There was no evacuation plan. There was no warning system. The roads out of the city had been jammed from early in the eruption, and by the time the pumice fall made walking genuinely dangerous, any organized retreat had become impossible. What remained was improvisation and love. A man was found in the gladiatorial barracks, in a room that was clearly not his, too finely decorated, too far from where he belonged, lying beside a woman of evident high status, her jewelry still on her wrists. They were not married. They were not family. They were two people who had found each other when the world ended. A dog in the house of Vesuvius Primus was found in a posture of extreme distress, its chain too short to escape the rising ash, its body twisted upward, evidence of a slow death over many hours that its owner had apparently fled without freeing it. And Pliny the Elder, uncle of Pliny the Younger, commander of the Roman fleet at Misenum, sailed toward the disaster, driven by both scientific curiosity and the desire to help. He reached the shore near Stabiae, on the far side of the bay. The pumice fall was too heavy to return by sea. He spent the night in a friend's house, reportedly sleeping soundly while the building shook, a detail his nephew preserved with unmistakable admiration. Before attempting to reach the beach the following morning, he collapsed and died there, likely overcome by the sulfurous gases that had already made the air near the shore nearly unbreathable. He was 56 years old. He had sailed toward a volcano to observe it more closely. His death was not a tragedy. It was a portrait. When the ash settled and the mountain finally quieted, somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 people were dead in Pompeii alone. The current estimate, based on excavated remains and population modeling. In Herculaneum, the death toll was proportionally higher. Across the broader Campanian region, including surrounding farms and smaller settlements, the total number of dead may have exceeded 16,000. The ratio that gives this its full physical weight: roughly 1 in 3 residents of Pompeii who had not already evacuated did not survive. The agricultural infrastructure of Campania, the vineyards, orchards, and farms that had fed the region for centuries, was buried under meters of ash. The Sarno River was so choked with volcanic debris that its course shifted permanently. The harbor that had made Pompeii's trade possible was filled. The Aqua Augusta aqueduct was destroyed. The second-order consequences spread outward like ripples. The regional economy collapsed. Property in the surrounding area became worthless overnight. Emperor Titus, who had come to power just 3 months earlier, redirected public funds to relief efforts and personally visited the devastated region twice. Several survivors petitioned for legal clarification on a novel problem. If a man had died intestate in the eruption and his heirs had also died, who inherited his estate? Roman law had no precedent for this. The world that had existed before was gone. Not metaphorically. Literally, physically, architecturally gone, buried under 4 to 6 meters of volcanic material, and subsequently forgotten so completely that the precise location of Pompeii was lost for over 1,500 years. The irony that defines Pompeii in the historical imagination is this: the event that killed it also preserved it. The same ash that suffocated its population sealed its streets, its paintings, its food, its graffiti, its bread, its furniture, its dogs, and its people in a moment of suspended time that no other ancient city possesses. Every other city of the Roman world has been continuously inhabited, rebuilt, demolished, repurposed, stripped for materials, and altered beyond recognition. Pompeii alone was sealed on a morning in late summer and left untouched for nearly 17 centuries. When excavations began in earnest in the 18th century, what emerged was not ruins but rooms, not fragments but faces. The technique of pouring plaster into the voids left by decomposed bodies, developed by archaeologist Giuseppe Fiorelli in 1863, produced casts that are among the most emotionally devastating objects in human history. People frozen in the last seconds of their lives, their postures telling stories no written account could replicate. A man covering his face, 2 children pressed together, a pregnant woman lying on her side. These are not historical data points. They are people. They were alive on the morning of August 24th, 79 AD. They had bread in the oven and ceramic jugs on shelves and dogs that needed feeding and elections coming and wine to drink and years ahead of them. Vesuvius did not simply destroy Pompeii. In its ash, it preserved the most intimate portrait of Roman life that history would ever produce, and in doing so, gave the dead the only kind of immortality that truly lasts.